Be the final Let's Talk Leadership live conversation for the next few weeks as we take a summer break. But we've got a very European flavour to today's conversation. So apart from Britt joining us from Holland, we've got Marcus joining us from Spain and Tim joining us from Germany. We've just been talking about the awful flooding and weather conditions that have caused chaos in Germany, and Tim's in the middle of it. And then also we've got Phil joining us from the Lake District. And for those of us in the UK, we're just sweltering in incredible heat and just waiting for the weather to break, which it plans to do at the weekend. But it's super to see you all. Thanks for joining us. Those who are listening in live, thanks for joining this morning. We're going to be talking about a number of things that are interlinked, but really the best advice we've ever been given, leadership advice, sort of nuggets of wisdom that we've learnt along the way, maybe sort of books that we found particularly informative. So we're going to range across those areas. Join in if you want to live. If not, add a comment. Send us a note after the conversation and share your views with us. One thing that will be happening is that while we have the summer break, we are going to capture the 6-word stories that we triggered off a few weeks ago with Ian's suggestion, and we're going to put those up on our website so that people can add to them and maybe invite one or two of the people who had those stories to actually come on one of these live conversations and give us the real story behind the 6 words. But so watch that space for the autumn. And we do have a program of conversations planned out for the autumn with slightly different things going on, school children being involved, young people being involved, as well as some quite well-known faces. So just for the time being, this is the last conversation, but we'll be kicking off again in September. So team, what are we going to talk about today? Who's going to kick off with a nugget of information or a book that they've read that has been with them for the rest of their lives, or something that someone said in the dim and distant past that they sort of have held in the back of their mind whenever they've been working with people? Who'd like to kick off and start? Stunned silence, as always.
Shall I start, Matthew, just because we were discussing the idea before? So yeah. I've got many books. I've often mentioned the books behind me. I know many of us are keen readers around the topic of leadership, but I remember when I was a young leader, one of the first books that I read was Who Moved My Cheese? And it was bought for me, or given to me actually. It was going around the offices of a telecoms company I worked for, and my manager at the time, called Duncan McIntyre, gave me this copy. Said, "Ian, read this and pass it along." So we were just passing it around the corridors of the office. But there was one particular phrase in that book, if you've read that book, Who Moved My Cheese, which says something like, "What would you do if you weren't so afraid?" And that's just something that stuck with me ever since. And I've read similar books later on about even eagles need a push. Sometimes even the bravest people need a little nudge. And of course you can nudge yourself. So, but what would you do if you weren't so afraid? And that's just been really helpful for me. Any difficult situation, just push yourself a little bit, just make a decision, do something. And it's probably the thing that you're probably most fearful of, but just face into it, give it a go. And it's never normally as bad as you think it will be. So thank you to Duncan for recommending the book, and I've used it as a gift and as a leadership reference book for many of my people that worked for me years ago when I was a young leader.
Great. So add on to that then, someone.
I can add on to that, because I think what I've benefited from is bits of philosophy, things that I've come across myself, but things that people have also said to me. And, I always like a bit of philosophy, but I like it in 1 or 2 sentences, so I don't have to read, 500 pages or something of a book to distill the information. And I remember many, many years ago, somebody quoted, it was Schopenhauer to me, which is quite a well-known quote that's used in business books now as well. And he said, all change passes through 3 stages. First, it's ridiculed, then it's violently opposed, and then it's taken as self-evident. And I think that's a great little reminder sometimes whenever we're leading change, going through change, about how things evolve, how there is a natural process resistance. And of course, we talked about resistance on here. We had Rick Maurer here, who's an expert on resistance. That there's a natural sort of ebb and flow in human beings whenever change comes along. In fact, Schopenhauer said all truth passes through 3 stages, but kind of it's adapted for the business world, of course, in terms of change. So I like these little quotes of 1 or 2 sentences, because I think they're really, really helpful in getting us 30,000 feet above the battle and away from sort of spreadsheets and discussions about individual people, and just to remind us to look, if you like, at the whole, not just the bigger picture, but the whole flow of things, maybe over centuries, and then back to what you have to solve in that particular moment. So that's just one thing that somebody said to me years ago, and I thought, yeah, that's absolutely right. It's always stuck with me.
Yeah. Interesting. And Tim, you said you like to talk, you like things in sort of short, bite size. Is that just a natural preference you have, or do you find it's just that it's those shorter things that tend to resonate with you most? My Myers-Briggs type profile is ISTP, and we like things sort of short and pragmatic, nice and quick. I like the idea of being able to summarize something that you can hang on to in particular moments, sort of give you a little bit of a kind of, what would you call it, that sort of center you a little bit. Yeah. But of course, you can always investigate things much further if you want to. I mean, everything's in Wikipedia or whatever, if you want to go further. But I do like to have very short little phrases just to ground yourself lying around sometimes. I mean, something else someone said to me many years ago as well, as we were working really hard on something, he said, yeah, well, life's more than merely staying alive. And I said, oh, that's good. Where'd you get that from? He said, oh, some Roman guy we studied at school. And it's something he did in Latin many, many years previously. Little things like that just anchor you, give you a bit of stability, whatever word you ground you, whatever word we want to use. Yeah. Right, there's 2 to start with. So, Britt, Marcus, any thoughts?
Shall I follow on? Yes. One thing that I heard many, many years ago that has stuck with me ever since is the phrase, "Who you are is how you lead." And it seems self-evident, but it really brought home to me the message that you can't take yourself out of the equation, whatever you do. So as a leader, you are in a way you're stuck with yourself, and you lead other people the way sometimes you would like to be led yourself. And it's really important to realize that there are loads of people who are very, very different from you. And so you have to take that into account when you are leading. And sort of linked to that is the idea that attitudes are contagious. So if you lead the way you are, and if you are naturally either a very bubbly person or a much more reflective person, you need to be aware of the fact that that has an impact on other people, either positively or negatively, but we impact each other almost all the time in lots of very subtle ways. And linked to that is another phrase that I heard that really stuck with me, which is happiness is a decision. And of course, you can't always control what happens to you. And sometimes terrible things happen that you really, you have absolutely no control over. But in almost all circumstances, you have a choice of how you react to that. And therefore, deciding that you will not be caught out and deciding that you will be resilient can be of huge help in weathering storms. So those are some of the nuggets that have stayed with me.
Thanks.
Well, let me build on that, Britt, because it's very similar. Very early on in my career, I had a crazy career, very fast. And at one point in my career, I was responsible for 6 companies with the HR dimension in the automotive industry. And part of my role was to deal with the unions. And one chunk of my responsibility was to be part of the bargaining process for 11,000 people. So I was in the team. I had a boss at that time. And the unions, as you may know, they have their own agenda. Sometimes they were aggressive. And they were just driving me mad. And I was famous in the company to be very, very hot-blooded. and I would be reactive, and I would be, whinging, moaning, complaining, and, like a good Spaniard, and just explosive. And then I remember this legal affairs director came up to me and he said, "You know what, Marcos, every time you lose composure, you lose in power." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, it's not what happens to you that matters. What really matters is the way you respond to what happens to you." Which for me was an eye-opener, because that immediately shifted my approach to the strategy I was displaying, to my approach with unions, with my way of relating. It kind of opened up my eyes to the way I was whinging, moaning, complaining, playing victim. And, and some of you, you still, you see me sometimes losing it. I'm still reactive. And I've been working on that on myself for 20 plus years, because it's, hang on a minute, I have the choice, Britt. I have the choice to choose how do I want to respond to this. So that has stayed with me, and I'm not perfect. I'm still working on it, and it's just opened up a wonderful field of empowerment and accountability for me.
I like this, Marcos, because it reminds me of one of the basic bits of psychology that I first learned a long time ago, which is the idea that we're not instinctive beings. We have the ability to consciously think things through. And psychology says more or less that it's the gap between stimulus and response, that we're not reactive. We can build in some conscious thought between what happens to us and how we respond to it. And what I like is that all of these perspectives that we develop from books or from sayings or from things that we remember sort of inform our conscious response. So we choose the way we want to respond to situations, and we're conscious of our automatic responses as well. And they all make me think of my nugget or situation that I refer to, which is always that in my early career I was thrown in at the deep end in various situations. I think all of us are at different times in different places, and how you respond to being thrown in at the deep end, it may be automatic. You may be afraid and avoid it and treat it as change that you don't want to happen to you, or you might be a person who likes challenges and achievements and the impossible and dives into it and is not afraid, but is actually on mission impossible in terms of the way you react. And the model or the idea, the nugget that I always remember with this, is getting that balance between sticking comfortably in your comfort zone or moving rapidly into a panic situation in either of those, depending on sort of person you are and the sort of situation you're in. And that there's a bit in between that, which is the enjoyable, hopefully, stretch that you might feel from that situation, which might be, for some people, being thrown into the deep end is, for other people, a stretch. And for other people, sticking around in your comfort zone is equally stressful in terms of wanting some variety or wanting some change. And consciously thinking, is this an enjoyable stretch? Or is it a panic? Or is it a bit boring in terms of comfort zone? Where am I, and how do I manage myself in that way? And how do I take on what is nowadays known as a challenging assignment to be able to react to that?
Yeah, and Phil, you've just reminded me, of course, of another book that doesn't, in a sense, have anything to do with business, but is often on leadership lists, which is Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, where, of course, there is the quote, "In the space between stimulus and response lies our infinite freedom." And yes. Of course, I mean, if we're talking about challenges, of course, he was in Auschwitz. He survived Auschwitz partly by imagining himself surviving and giving talks about how it was to survive Auschwitz while he was actually there. And of course, that's what he did. And he lived another 30, 35 years after the war. And I think, this is one of the great books for, this sort of inner struggle or inner battle that anyone goes through, and particularly a leader. So it's the ultimate resilience book. So again, stimulus response just made me think of Viktor Frankl, of course. Yeah.
I've been listening and thinking, gosh, books, yes. And I think on reflection, and it may be an age thing now, I find I've picked up little nuggets of wisdom from very different places. I think, to be fair, most of my early nuggets would have been from direct experience. So picking up on what you said, Phil, I joined a company on the very to do some work, and on the very first day there was a white envelope sitting on my desk. In those days we had desks, no computers, nothing, and there was a little note saying, "Please open the envelope." And I opened the envelope, and it was a ticket on the North Sea ferry from Hull to Rotterdam for about 2 days later, with a note saying, "We expect you to go to Holland and don't come back until you've done some business." That was literally my sort of induction into the world of commerce. And I remember arriving in Europort, violently ill, having been in the bottom of this ship for about 8 hours across the North Sea, thinking, not only do I have to get rid of my seasickness, but, where do I go? Who do I speak to? I don't know Dutch. I'd never been to Holland before. I haven't even got a list of contacts. Where do I start? And I've often thought about that and thought that I wouldn't want to inflict that on anyone else. But it was a learning experience. But I think for me, two things have happened recently. Two things that I've heard. I was watching a Scandi-noir crime thriller the other week, called one of the series on the killing, and there's a psychologist in that who's talking to one of the participants who's just lost a family member, and the psychologist used the word grief is love that's been made homeless. And I thought, hold on, no, I can't believe a Scandi-noir writer would have made that up. It must be a quote from somewhere. And it was interesting when I then, to pick up on Tim, Wikipedia, there's no end of quotes. But I listened to that, I thought, hey, that's powerful. And then the other, which I just recently come across, is I'm reading Mark Carney's book, Values. Mark was the ex-governor of the Bank of England and is now a UN representative for climate. And he's written a book on values, and his very first chapter is about how value is created, going way, way back into the dark ages, and how originally it was what you could produce on a unit of land, what you could actually produce from a unit of land. And boy, did that make me think how, if we could get back to trying to help people do things in a much clearer and simpler way, how looking at some of the very complex problems would it might be helpful. But I'm reading this book with fascination. I mean, it's all about economics and everything, stuff I've never touched on. But just this whole concept, and where does money come from, and what is it? And so I'm finding in the latter stages of my career, picking up books or listening to things that I wouldn't normally listen to is just full of really, really interesting insights, which maybe in my earlier life I wouldn't even picked up a book on Values by Mark Carney. I wouldn't even looked at it on a bookshelf, but I'm drawn to it now. So I don't know whether it's the same experience for others, but that one about grief is love that's been made homeless, I think is incredibly powerful, because you could reduce it down and say, any sorrow, any difficulty in life is actually the fact that what you were enjoying or what you were doing or what you were has just been made homeless for a while, and you need to find a new home. It's quite powerful.
It makes me think, when we think back to the pure essence of what leadership is, then, Matthew, is leadership just pure facilitation, however you define facilitation? So in the case of somebody in a team suffering with a real loss, facilitating that person's and helping that person just to really cope with that from a loving, caring perspective, while still delivering business outcomes and everything else. So as part of a team, is that the ultimate thing about leadership? We are helping people by facilitation of conversations, of processes, of change, or whatever it is, and that's what basically it is.
Yeah, and I mean that we did a whole piece on Let's Talk Leadership about the Charlie Mackesy book, and right at the back of that, the boy, the mole, the fox, and the horse is the phrase, and the lovely little picture that kindness sits gently behind everything. That however, and picking up on Marcus's point, however much you're ranting and taking and frustrated and want to try and get things done, at the end of it, if you can just hold on to the thought that actually being kind doesn't mean to say you have to be soft or gentle, but just being kind, being considerate is hugely important as a leader.
Yeah. I read something about conflict management the other day, where the person who wrote the article said sometimes it helps when you are in a conflictual situation with other people, although you might not be inclined to be kind, but sometimes it's really helpful to ask yourself before you reply, so before you become reactive, is this the kindest reply or the kindest question I can now ask? And it might sound counterintuitive, but it can actually take the angle out of a conflict when you do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good challenge, isn't it? Because if I think back to the first time I was taught about leadership from a feedback point of view, when you're going to give people feedback, honest and kind, not honest or kind, it's honest and kind. And sometimes kindness is maybe not to say it that way, or not even to give that particular piece of feedback, because it wouldn't be kind maybe in the situation. But it's a good question to ask. Is it the right thing to do? Is it kind, and is it honest? Like tough love, for example.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we can talk about experiences and remembrances and things, but when I went to boarding school, I was privileged to do that, although for circumstances that weren't privileged. And I remember there was a housemaster called George Selleck, typical housemaster, unmarried, been in the school all his life. Very much a bachelor who sort of wandered around the boarding house muttering to himself and then sort of making kind comments and sometimes gruff comments to the boys in his charge. And we used to have to queue up on a Friday evening to get our pocket money. And he had a big ledger, and the pocket money, the cash, was kept in an empty gold block tobacco tin. He was a pipe smoker. And so he delved around in the tin trying to find the right coinage for people. But under the tin were the notes. 10-shilling notes in those days. And most of the boys got a 10-shilling note. And when it came to me, he used to hand me the equivalent of now 10 pence. And he would look at me and he'd say, just remember that 10 pence to your mother is as valuable as the 10 shillings that I'm giving to some of the other boys. And it was that ability for him in that moment to connect with individuals, not to be critical, not to be unkind, not to sort of say, oh, aren't you lucky you've got 10 shillings, or aren't you unlucky you've only got 10p, but that ability just to make a comment at the right moment, at a point where he could sense my sensitivity around the fact that my 10p in the tuck shop wasn't going to go anywhere near as far as 10 shillings that were being given in old money. And I think those moments when you meet people who've got that ability, particularly leaders, just to take the moment and make it special for the person that they're talking to, hugely important, hugely important. That moment in time, that leader, however important they are, for you, that's the person they're concentrating on. Nothing else matters. And I think that's really, really powerful, because that sort of thing sticks. I mean, I can recount that now. I can see myself in that fun little room with a gold block tobacco tin and all the coins rattling around in it and the pile of notes by it. And it just makes you realize, you think, yeah, something like that has an impact on you, and you try and carry that forward in your life. And I suppose that's a form of, that was kindness. He was being kind to me in the moment.
I think it brings us back to Britt's comment about taking the perspective of the other person, which is not to lead people the way you'd like to be led yourself, but to consider what it's like from their point of view, which is, I suppose, kindness in that it's considerate or a consideration of who they are and what they're like, and then acting in a way which fits with them, as opposed to fits only your model, but looking at their model. For example, your horrendous challenge of landing in the Netherlands and so under-equipped and sick might it sounds terrible to most of us, but might for some people be something they consider to be a fantastic and exciting challenge and the sort of thing that they'd love to do. And we have to consider quite often the perspective of the other person might be so different to ours that we need to lead them in a way which we would not like at all. And I think a lot of the perspective taking that we do, the consideration of their point of view, does lead us to think of things often very differently, which comes back to a lot of our different ideas of what is it like from their point of view, and how can we be kind or considerate or considered in terms of managing them in the way they would like to be managed. So for me, I like the nuggets which are especially startling insights, things that shock us into looking at something completely differently to try to consider it, perhaps because they're more memorable and they're more easy to insert into that gap we have between stimulus and response. Because it's very difficult. I mean, Marcos is your example of an automatic reaction that you've had all of your life. We all have that, and expecting to be conscious about it when we're so busy and challenges are so big, it is a huge challenge to be sort of acting consciously. But I guess if there's a startling or shocking insight that we have from a nugget or book or perspective, it's going to be more memorable. It's going to occur to us more in the moment, more easily.
It's certain cultures feel, of course, that's just passion, right, in the way that we express it. But it's recognizing those differences. But you triggered another thought in my mind, Phil. There's a guy I worked for called Mark Durnley many years ago, and he said, Ian, it's all about having an iron fist with a velvet glove. That was his metaphor. And I thought, what on earth are you talking about? And he explained it, that we have to be tough on the decisions and soft on the way we implement it. And then he continued to explore the metaphor of this iron fist with a velvet glove. Over time, the velvet glove wears a little bit thin on the knuckles, so you can see the shiny iron fist underneath. So you just know that there's still a lot of strength there. And I just love that, because he wasn't a really aggressive or a strong leader in that really powerful or overused power way, but there was a strength there, but it was softened with that kindness, with that appreciation, that compassion. Marcos, we've spoken much about compassion over the years, but there's also a strength in there as well, and I think we can all have that. But that really stuck with me, iron fist, velvet glove. And he said we often get it the wrong way around. It's a really soft, like a big mitten with a piece of tinfoil inside. In other words, we're soft on decision, and then we're really clumsy in the way that we implement change, for example, Tim, in the work that we've done before. And it's just not the right way to do it. People don't actually respond that way. It's not tough love. It's just kind of, it doesn't have that kind of, backbone inside of it.
Now it's more wishy-washy, and I guess it's also uncertain. It's more like people don't know what you're doing when the decisions are all over the place, or the decision process.
Exactly. Yeah. But good metaphor as well.
Yeah, it's a bit this, I've made a tough decision, so things should now fall into line behind that tough decision sort of idea, which is often, the ultimate poor leadership, I think. Yeah.
Well, exactly. Yeah. You have to involve people, of course, in that decision-making process, but yeah.
I do think there's something quite powerful about either searching out for unusual experiences or trying to make the best of something that you find yourself in. Because I mean, if I take the Rotterdam example, when I got back from Holland about 10 days later, having been reasonably successful by my own standards in A, surviving, and B, driving on the other side of the road, and C, actually finding some Dutch people who wanted to do business with me, I asked my boss, I said, out of interest, is that how you normally induct people into this business, or was that just something special for me? And he said, well, I remember watching you in the Philippines 3 years ago, going into businesses in the Philippines and asking questions of people that you'd never met before. And I thought, right, the best way to get Hunter fast-tracked into getting this job done is to just chuck him into Holland and see what happens. And I said, well, thanks very much. He said, yeah, but you were successful. you survived, you've come back with some business, not much, but you've come back with something. So onwards and upwards. And I think, although it was horrendous at the time, it does, those sort of experiences, I think, do help you when you then perhaps later in life meet something that's much more serious. You at least think, well, okay, I think, rather than worry about this too much, let's just work through it. Let's just find people who can help or support or give advice. Let me think back on experiences I've had. Let's try and cope with it and deal with it, rather than just sort of get really worried and concerned about it. Because a number of times you meet people who are really worried about things, and you say something trite like, but the sun will come up tomorrow morning, we'll still, go back to where we started, you'll still be breathing and alive. It just doesn't somehow seem to cut to cut it. But if you can sort of say, well, and saying something like, well, I've been there myself, I think it's awful. I've heard people say that. Oh, yes, I know exactly how you're feeling. I've been there myself. No, you haven't. You haven't got a clue how I'm thinking. So this whole business about trying to understand where someone's coming from and listening to them and being kind and being considerate and yes, being tough, I think is really powerful, really powerful.
And I wanna add a new dimension to the conversation, because we talked about reading or hearing, but I do remember a time where, and I still remember like your team box, Matthew, but there was this leader and the way he smiled at me at a time that I was extremely nervous, because it was my first time in headquarters, and I just stepped in, my boss who got ill and wanted me to represent him in an European meeting with senior directors. And I was just 27 and I was just melting down and in fear. And I was just like, this is too much for me. There's no way I'm going to stand in front of these people and do a presentation. And I do remember that when they called out my name, I stood up. And don't ask me why. I laid my eyes on his eyes. He was the European chief of HR. And the way he looked at me, the way he smiled at me, the way he transmitted, you'll do fine. We're here to support you. No need to panic. Everything that he said without opening up his mouth, I still remember, because that flipped my attitude and kind of reassured me that I would do fine. And he didn't say anything. It's the way he looked at me, the way he smiled at me. He just transmitted to me what I needed at that time in order to best represent my boss at that time.
Yeah, I mean, Tim, it's interesting. Tim reminded me yesterday that it's 15 years since I think 3 of us joined the Center of Creative Leadership as associates. And the 2 weeks we had to go through in August in sort of being vetted and assessed. And I remember we had to do an activity. I mean, it was horrendous, because I remember arriving in the building then, and everyone was speaking lots of different languages, and I spoke no language other than English. And then I heard them making comments about how they were mostly psychologists, or they'd done all this work for years, and I'd done none of it. And I literally climbed under the table to plug my laptop in and sort of for about 5. I mean, I will admit it now publicly. But we had to do an activity which all of us have used since, with called Visual Explorer. And I was at a particularly sort of just at a moment in time when things were a little bit difficult. And I couldn't get out of the room, having looked at the pictures. I was stuck in the room staring at these pictures, and everyone else had sort of grabbed their picture and gone back into the main room, and the conversations had started. And I was actually in tears, because one of the pictures had triggered a real emotional response to me. Anyway, I managed to get back into the room, and there was a lovely, lovely Spanish lady. I can't remember her name, and in fact, I don't think she got through the assessment, which I think was sad. She just sat next to me, and she gently rubbed my arm. That's all she did. She just gently rubbed my arm. And everyone else at the table was saying, oh, yes, this is my picture, and this is what it means to be. And she just kept rubbing my arm. And by the time it got to me, just the rubbing of the arm was enough to get me through that emotional response I'd had, and to get me sort of back onto a slightly more sensible, less emotional plane. Some little touch like that, the smile you mentioned. hugely important at those moments. And again, they remain, I think they remain with you for life. You remember those moments.
And I wonder, Matthew, if the visual way that we've been using things like Zoom, MS Teams, and we're using a different sort of system here today, but this very visual thing, Marcos, you know, are we more conscious of the way that we are projecting our own thoughts? Because if I look at some characters in a crowd or on a Zoom call, sometimes you're not quite sure what they're thinking because there's a very different expression going on. And I sometimes joke with participants on you know, live workshops that there's a face that I see which looks a bit like this. And that face has two meanings. It could either mean that oh no, I get it, Ian, I'm just processing what you're saying, or it could mean I have no idea what you're talking about, and you know, we don't know. So sometimes these very subtle body language images that we give can just give somebody just complete relaxation and confidence that they're going to be okay, because the big boss, whoever he or she is just smiling and nodding, and you're going to be okay. Or you're really worried because you have no idea if you've captured the hearts or the minds of the people you're in front of. But all these little micro behaviors are so important. And I just wonder, with the virtual way that we've been working, if we're more in tune to that, because some of us prefer to take the visual, the selfie off the screen, for example. But I found it actually very useful just to check the mirror to see what maybe we are projecting.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think there is another aspect, Ian, particularly when we're working with Zoom and Teams, which is you can never really be sure that somebody isn't immersed in something else as well. So they might be processing what you said and thinking, oh, it's interesting, whatever, but they can be absolutely immersed in, I don't know, creating a PowerPoint presentation or something, which is harder when you're physically with people in person. They might have a laptop open in a meeting or something. But I think it's much easier for people to be looking over your shoulder in, you know, whatever we call it, a classroom or a meeting room or something like that. And I'm very aware that you've got to be careful with the stories that you tell yourself and manage the stories other people are telling themselves. But I'm completely convinced that sometimes people are absolutely, you know, not listening at all and working on something, as I say, that requires not just an email to look at, but, you know, something like a presentation or a spreadsheet or something, which is also, you know, another element of working live, not just training live or coaching, but any form of business interaction, I would say. How present are people at any given moment?
And it's a very fragile thing, isn't it, Tim? You've reminded me of another book by, I think it's Professor Max Atkinson, and it's the book is called Lend Me Your Ears.
Oh yeah.
Lend me your ears. And what a great way to you know, to connect with people, because that's you make the request, as opposed to saying, will you please listen to me, you know, lend me your ears for a few moments. All of a sudden people might lean in, but no, you're quite right, and this method can be challenging.
Yeah.
That reminds me of something that I was taught during my coach training, which we've all heard, I'm sure, which is we were all born with 2 ears and 1 mouth. You should use that to remind yourself that you should be listening about twice as much. You should spend about twice as much time listening as you spend talking, because as soon as you start talking, you take up airtime and you can't listen to others anymore.
And there's 2 extra ears just come into your picture.
Yes, I know. It's I know. So I was a little bit guilty when you said, Tim, that sometimes people are doing other things while being in a conversation. I was stroking Ollie. I was.
Yeah, but that helps focus. It's not the same as I say,
He's a great leader.
writing a report or something.
I know. Yeah.
I read a post, just to switch to a different topic just for a moment. I read a post from a friend of mine and a colleague that we haven't worked together for a long time. His name is Chris, and he asked the question: do we want our leaders to be vulnerable? And he what I love about this guy, Chris, is he's often using a topic which I immediately relate to, but then he's flipping it upside down, and it's challenging for me, because he was basically saying, no, we don't, because if you define vulnerable as being open to harm, and all the negative parts of vulnerability, he said clearly we don't want our leaders to be like that, but he was just being provocative. And it led to some really interesting comments. And I don't know if you read all comments to posts that trigger maybe a reaction in you, but I'm fascinated by the different reactions. And Brit, where people are not listening with 2 ears and already reacting to something, because he was just being provocative. But it's really interesting, because I believe that vulnerability is the foundation of all trust. But then again, one can be too vulnerable in as much as you can overshare, if you
Yeah.
like. Getting that ratio right can be a real challenge. I'm not sure if you have a view on vulnerability, but it does link to trust. And I think building trust virtually, face to face, in small teams, in bigger teams, but being credible, things like that. It's a delicate balance of being vulnerable enough, maybe, to be authentic. Any views on that?
I think the theme that we've been talking about is mainly how people feel at work, being led, or in the different situations that they're in. And a lot of our nuggets are about how we consider our emotions or consider the emotions of others, which doesn't get very much airtime at work. Not that we should all walk about asking people how they feel. That would be terrible. But that we might be thinking about that and thinking about how we feel ourselves. Because a lot of the leadership nuggets or books are very mechanical and are considering things which are very transactional almost. And yet all the things we're talking about are how people feel and how we feel and how we take account of how other people feel and and even how that's developed working online with people mainly rather than working with them in person. And I like this bit about how difficult it is, or how there are different channels now when we're working with people in this way, talking with people in different rooms. I'm still fairly convinced, once I've got to know somebody only online, talking to them over the camera, that I can see when they get distracted and flick to an email. And there's a expression that is probably different for different people, but there's definitely an expression that they get on their face when they are answering a text or doing something off screen that is not. And it's a sort of a blankness, or it is basically, I know it when I see it, rather than being able to define it. And I also have to take account of the fact that sometimes I know that they're very focused on me, talking with me, that looks entirely different to if I was talking to them in person, because in person they'd be looking me in the eye, whereas they may be looking in the eye, but my eyes are on a screen which is 90 degrees to the camera that they're looking at. And so, and that can lead me to feel annoyed with them because they're distracted when they're not distracted, or equally considerate of them because something important has cropped up as a emergency in the corner of their screen, which most of us find impossible to turn off. Yeah, there's pop-ups happen all the time that say, here's an emergency, you may be online, but there's a text with something important cropped up. And it's back to the consideration we have of other people, isn't it, and their situation and what challenges they have to take account of in interacting with them.
And that may, if you extend that a little bit, Phil, that's the whole idea of being present with people, isn't it? And if we could teach any of the young leaders out there about the importance of connecting with people, whether it be their customers, their suppliers, their team members, their bosses, if you can truly be present with somebody digitally, face to face, on a phone call, as well, without video, that's such a special gift to give to people, so they know they've got all of you for those brief moments, maybe when it matters. And the minute you break that, then it's okay, but it's gone at that point. So it's very fragile. But to be fully present and make that choice is I think is a real gift.
And yet the signals for that are very different, aren't they now? Because the intimate gaze doesn't exist online. And yet that's what was in the audience for you, Marcos, when your HR manager gave you the look of reassurance, which we know when we're presenting, but we're quite often less aware of when we're in the audience, that it can be so helpful, and even less aware of when we're in the audience on a 30-person seminar that's online, and we're one of the screens that just is very powerful when you see a nodding head on the screen when you're speaking. So
let me connect what Ian and Phil you're saying with a conversation I had about 2 weeks ago, where I was challenged to put together a program on mental resilience. And their challenge was that they were trying to run a program for people coming back into the office with COVID-19 and after the pandemic, and people are struggling, etc., etc. And then in the room was a psychologist who claimed to be an expert in mental health, etc. And I said to the person, I said, listen, I think that if we only tap into the mental, I think it would fall short, because I think we need to tap into the heart and the feelings and the reconnection. Are we willing to vulnerably share our feelings and our experiences? Because social distancing has translated as social isolation. And it's not the same thing. And people are coming back, and some people are afraid. They don't know how to reconnect. Maybe they're very hurt. Maybe they've lost some important loved ones. We don't know. But if we only run the program mentally, I feel it's going to fall short. Now, it was funny. That was the end of the conversation. That's it. They said, well, I need to think about this, and I have never heard back from them. So I just wanted to make the connection of how important it is, at least for me in these times, of something that you've said, Ian, about fierce compassion, and how compassion may play a key role in bringing people back together. Because so far, I think people are starting to disconnect, and some people have forgotten how to reconnect.
Well, I just find with all of these conversations, it sort of triggers off things. I literally this morning was clearing out some old files, and I came across an article in which Carl Jung was quoted. And I thought, I'll just glance, before I chuck it in the bin, I'll glance at it. And basically, it was Carl Jung saying, forget your books, forget your university degrees, forget your studying, forget everything that you've ever been taught. Just go out into the street, and his words, into the cafes, into the brothels, into the churches, into the shops, into the parks, and you will see around you humankind, and you will learn more about human interaction by just being in those places than you'll ever learn out of a book or at university or college. It's just interesting how that's just popped out of my head as a result of this conversation, because a man who suffered severely from mental ill health for a lot of his life actually was saying something that I think we've all been saying this morning as being a fundamental part of being a leader, that you have to be out there, you have to meet people, you have to communicate, you have to show compassion, you have to understand. But
in the spirit of the Olympics, maybe Matthew running right now, leadership is a contact sport, right? It's something you have to do with people. And it reminds me of an old boss that said, Ian, when are you going to stop reading all your books and start doing some of it? That was a bit unfair, if you like, because he knew I was trying various techniques. The point was very similar, Matthew, to what you're saying there, is that, and then write your own books about what you've done. And I think that's why there are so many books on leadership, because it's not about what you should do. It's most people saying, this is what worked for me. And they're using it as kind of like crumbs of the path they followed, so you can follow similarly, but you have to navigate your own path. I think that's the thing. And which leads me to another question around apologies, and being authentic enough to say I'm sorry when we make mistakes, because if it is a contact sport, inevitably we're going to make some errors of judgment, maybe a little bit too soft or too hard or whatever, and there'll be a reason then that we have to apologize. And it reminds me of a guy that I may have mentioned to some of you that I worked with a long time ago. I'll come to him in a moment, but in his book he speaks about regret, reason and remedy, the 3 R's: regret, reason, remedy. And I just love it, because the first thing is, say you're sorry, express regret for a situation, even if you weren't totally responsible for it. Then explain why it happened and what your thinking was and the reasons maybe for your behavior. And then most importantly, at the end, the remedy, state what you're going to do about it to put it right, make it better, or deal with it. And of course, those 3 things often are always missing. People don't say sorry, don't explain why the situation happened, and the thing that you really want is, how is this going to get fixed? Never comes along. Yeah.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Yeah, it's regret, reason, remedy. It's such an easy concept, not an easy thing to do. Who was it? Elton John. Sorry seems to be the hardest word, right?
Yeah, exactly. I just thought of that.
Yeah. But it's and I think that it's sort of saying sorry is no longer cool. When in fact I think it's so disarming to say sorry, and then move on at that point. But is it this whole legal world that we live in right now? It's sometimes an obstacle.
And also for some people, it's seen as a weakness.
Yeah.
If you're saying sorry, because it means you know that you were wrong, and you can't be wrong in some areas of life.
Yeah, but I think it's great strength just to own the situation on behalf of, because most people want to know it wasn't their fault if there is a question of whose fault was it.
Yeah.
And linked to that, I heard a coach with whom I worked many years ago who said, "Don't be afraid of saying I don't know."
Yeah.
And you don't know, but this is better to say that to pretend to know when everyone else knows that you're pretending to know when you don't know.
Yes.
No, I have to disagree completely, Marcos.
Yes.
The politician would say, you have to just say, well, no, the question you're asking, Marcos, which I do know the answer to, is this one. And that's what many people do. But to actually admit, I don't know, but I know people who might know, or I can go find out, or we can go find out, we can get an answer to this. But yeah, what you know is a drop in your ocean of ignorance, right? It's just, although we're pretty smart people, we don't know everything. Can't possibly do that as a leader. Yeah. Although some people expect it.
This takes me to the theorist that I learned the most from, which was Carl Rogers, and my favorite quote from him, which is still, "You can't teach anybody anything. You can just help them learn." And so much of that is the when you think of leadership textbooks or leadership lectures in those terms, then I like your idea, Ian, of this is just a model that I can look at and compare to my own experience and see. I like your breadcrumbs that you can follow, that is leading us down somebody else's journey, because that's a very challenging perspective to take as a management educator, to say you can't teach anybody anything, they can just learn from you. And Carl Rogers basically said, well, what do you then as a therapist or educator bring to the party? Which was then, as a facilitator, it's more about you and you being genuine and authentic and vulnerable and honest in terms, and that's what the relationship helps the person to learn and to in therapy terms, get better. Which means that a lot of this is about finding how we can be most genuine as a leader, because most people know anyway who we lead, because they can see us, and they can see if it's a facade or if it's just mechanical, or we don't want to go to particular areas, like the person that you were speaking to, Marcos, who doesn't want to touch on the feelings side of leadership at all. So they've got a pretty good idea of what we're about.
On that note, I think I noticed the time has rushed on ahead, and the COVID dog is barking in the background on you. Can I just say to all of us this morning, thanks for joining in on the conversation and sharing our thoughts and ideas. Many years ago, I met a gentleman called Frank Salisbury, who'd written a book on facilitation. And as I opened the page of the book, on the front page was, "Most facilitation is manipulation," in inverted commas. That sat with me for a long time over the years. But if those of us who have been having a chat, if it's triggered off some conversations in people who've been listening in or who might be watching this at a later date, do just share your thoughts. Again, just whack it onto email to us, put it on LinkedIn, whichever way you want to communicate, and we'll try and get it up over the August holiday period on our website. So thanks for joining us, Phil, Marcus, Tim, Britt, Ian, and Ian. Enjoy your summer break if you're having one. Stay safe, and we'll see all of us again in the autumn, in September. Great, thanks for joining.
Great, thanks a lot. Thanks for the invite.
Thank you.
See you, everyone.
See you, everyone.
Bye.